Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to all of the hosts and to everyone for taking the time to be here. It's incredibly touching, and I feel so humbled to see friends and leaders from all across the country here. I have shared before that this has been, in some ways, an unexpected turn in my life, that I grew up as the oldest kid to parents who immigrated from Taiwan. And most of my childhood was focused on fulfilling the charges that my family, my parents laid out for each one of our kids over and over and over again. When you grow up, get a job that pays a lot of money, is stable, and won't get you in trouble, right? So politics was never supposed to be anywhere on the list. And I never saw anyone who looked like me in those positions, and never imagined that an Asian American girl could ever be involved in this role. I knew from a young age, though, that I could help connect people together, and that the, in some ways, difficult circumstances that my parents had faced as immigrants to this country were giving me the skills to be able to navigate and connect with all different communities. I know from my childhood what it means to be the translator and interpreter in the family for the grownups in my life. And I knew, starting from my early 20s, what it meant to be a caregiver as well. My mom has been struggling with fairly serious mental illness for a number of years now. And in the first onset, it was very, very difficult for the family. I was 23 years old, and all of a sudden finding myself in the role of raising my two sisters, who were 10 and 16, and caring for my mom, who was going through tremendous struggles in that moment. And I think so many of us, it's an experience in life and a transition point in your life when you get to the point where you are switching roles, the child and the parent, when you become the caregiver to those who have done so much and taken such care of you. And for me, it happened much earlier in my life than I was expecting, in my early 20s. But you realize in those moments how much your parents had already prepared you for then, how much the values and the lessons and the love had from my mom was getting me ready to that moment where in some ways I would be caring for her. And that's the type of leadership that I believe our culture represents, that our society needs, and that especially at the city level can truly make a difference in Boston and across other cities. That this moment we are in our country is so consequential, coming out of a pandemic that has revealed how fragile our systems have been for a very long time. We're also looking ahead to a future that is shaped by climate vulnerabilities, as we see the wildfires out west affecting not just so many communities right around there, but all across the country. And as a mom, I think in those time scales at the same time. What does it mean to be completely focused on right now and what is urgent and what our kids need? Are they happy and fed and safe? But also in the same breath, are they growing up to be the people that we dream of for themselves? Are we creating the city and the world that we will be proud to pass on to them? That's the kind of leadership that I have been showing over the last 8 years as a city councilor, and that will bring Boston to the next level in the executive role. In my time on the council, we've been responsible for taking on big fights for one time and again, showing that more is possible when we build coalitions and dream of something bigger for our city. From language access that fully took down barriers for residents who don't speak English, to paid parental leave, which protected our city workers in a time of growing their families, from climate resiliency and ramping up our renewable energy sourcing, to equity in our city contracting and how we were spending our dollars. The city of Boston has tremendous resources. As Alec was saying earlier, we are a city whose history has shaped the course of history. And I'm very proud that in this moment, Boston has a chance to make history once again with your help, and to once again be the city whose leadership is leading the way for a society that truly sees every one of us and is planning for our brightest future together. So I'm so grateful for your help and support. We are really down to the wire, 54 days to go until the election. In the numbers that have come out, we are feeling very strong, but it is a complicated race with 8 names that will be on the ballot for mayor. We have been leading the polls that have come out and have been top so far. And there are 2 stages to this election. On September 14th, the top 2 candidates will move on. And then on November 2nd, there will be the final election. This is a nonpartisan race in Boston. So it is really about every single vote, even for September 14th. And we are running the campaign that has the greatest spread, meeting people where they're at with the biggest team, going door to door in all languages and with materials that represent the diversity of our city. But that requires more resources. And so we're going to keep up that same level of outreach. And I'm so grateful that leaders from across the country are interested in investing in the future of Boston, because we recognize how connected we are all across the United States and what a difference it would make, and how honored I would be if we were to be in a role where Boston's history could take down barriers that would have an impact far beyond Massachusetts. So thank you so much for your support.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Your background history is definitely inspiring, and I definitely believe the challenges we experience in life shapes our characters and perspectives. I'm sure there are a lot of specific topics you would like to talk about and our audience would like to hear. So why don't I bring in my co-host, Tom Long, who is the founder of Nerds for Humanity, and he will moderate a fireside chat with you, and you guys can dig into topics of interest. Hi, Tom.
Thanks, Alec. Pleasure to meet you, Michelle, and an honor to moderate this conversation. I'd like to pick up off of something you said in your opening remarks about how when you were in your early 20s, you had to rise to the occasion and take care of your sisters and help your mom out. You mentioned that there were some values and lessons that you had acquired by then that prepared you for that moment. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what some of those were.
When I first got the call from my sister that something was very wrong, I was on a pathway that was very aligned with what my parents had laid out, right? I had just graduated from college. I was working in a consulting role, living a young professional life in Boston, earning enough to support my life and to be able to pay back my student loans and all of that. And when the call came and my sister said, "You have to come home now," I didn't know what to expect, frankly. When I got home, and my family was living in the suburbs of Chicago, then I realized that it was far worse than I even imagined. My mom was not eating very much, hardly sleeping at all, self-medicating with alcohol a bit, and experiencing deep delusions, hearing cries for help that no one else could hear. And therefore, my mom is the strongest person I know. When all my childhood, she would teach us, if you see someone in trouble, do not turn your back on them. You go in there, you figure out how you can help. And so as she was hearing cries for help, even if everyone said it's not real, just ignore it, she was still running out of the house, sometimes 2 a.m., 3 a.m. The police were getting called by the neighbors for the disruption. And I really had no sense, even from 1 hour to the next, of whether she would be safe, right? Just constantly scanning, running outside, bringing her back in, trying to keep everyone stable. And in those moments of not knowing what the next day would look like, much less, having any sort of semblance of a life plan or a trajectory anymore. I think I was drawing on my immigrant parents' resilience, that over my childhood, watching them face just impossible circumstances, learning a completely new language, facing the isolation without family in the area, trying to navigate foreign culture. And thinking about how every weekend they would find ways to provide some touch points of culture and tradition and stability. And we would drive more than an hour to get to that Wenjiao Zhongxing, where there was the cultural hub, there was the grocery store that had the, vegetables that they wanted for the week. And then we would drive more than an hour back, and we would listen to tapes in the car on the way there and back that were, whether it was Peking opera or some other, programming in Mandarin. We were sent to language school, Mandarin language school that was run by the local Taiwanese American community. And whenever there was some sort of unexpected stress, the sort of familiar refrain back in the family was, there will be uncertainty, there will be discrimination or disappointment or whatever it was, but you just find a way, right? At that moment, it was often with the lesson of just keep your head down and work harder, which I have come to believe that we need to both work hard, but also change the dynamic and change the systems. But I think in those early moments, dealing with crisis, it was very much finding a strength that I didn't know I had inside me of, we will find a way and we will do it as a family and with the values of taking care of everyone who is here.
Well, thank you for sharing that color. It's certainly super inspiring and just really, really impressive and expresses a humanity to you that is really refreshing. I'd love to kind of fast forward a little bit, because eventually you made it back to school and you went to HLS. And I'm guessing coming out of there, you could have gone back, you could have gone to some white shoe law firm or back into consulting. You chose to work in city government. And is that also tie into this notion of service, or how was that decision? How did you decide to do that?
In fact, there were some unexpected doors that were opened in my life. And as I was starting law school, this was still my mom in the deep challenge of mental health crisis and eventually getting the diagnosis of late onset schizophrenia. And so I came back to law school, not, as a kind of what you would think of as a traditional law student, maybe a little older than a college student, but still focused and dedicated on their studies every night and needing to memorize all those legal holdings and focus on their classes. But I came as a member of a family that still very much needed care. So my sisters were with me, my mom was with me. And I remember, walking into the first day of law school, my professor was brilliant, a little terrifying at first. It was Elizabeth Warren. And that many days I would have to send her an email saying, sorry, I am missing class today or need to leave early for class today because my mom is in the hospital again. Right. So there was this constant juxtaposition of the roles that I was playing and in all different parts of that. And so law school for me in some ways wasn't just a standard experience of law school that might set you on a path to getting that kind of job. I was immersed in the hospital with, in the community and feeling so frustrated with the systems that I had come up against that I wanted to try to do something about it. I managed to get an internship in City Hall working for the late former mayor, Tom Menino. and had free reign in that experience to try to make a difference. And what I realized was that, especially at the city level, government is powerful, and it can be used either to block, to frustrate, to create hoops and barriers, or to meet people where they're at and to simplify systems and build in language access and focus on the changes that we needed to do as a society. I think in some ways also just the sudden shock of what had happened with my mom. She was the rock of our family, truly, the person who kept all of us kids on the right schedules and managing everything and coming to our class field trips all the time, and every year doing a demonstration of dumpling making for Lunar New Year, whether I wanted her to come to school to do that or not. And over just a couple of weeks, it just was almost like that person was gone from our lives. And so the sense of just how precious every moment is, just how quickly things can change, I really felt like I had seen the venue and the platform to be able to make a difference in city government. And I was not going to waste any minute in waiting to try to change that system for other families.
How is your mother doing now, if I may ask?
She is right downstairs, probably in the room downstairs and a little over. We live in a 2-family home in the neighborhood of Roslindale in Boston, and she's doing so. I mean, it's night and day now compared to in the depths and early on in her mental health journey. There were multiple hospitalizations. There was a great deal of follow-up care, and eventually we realized that being able to live together was part of providing a stability for her and for us that is just priceless, right? Being able to see how she is every morning, to send my kids downstairs to have breakfast with Waipoa every morning. There's a lot of extra stuff that comes with it. She's all here checking through my mail every day and this and that. But I feel so blessed to be in a city where the healthcare system got us here. The schools got us here with my sisters who I raised, both graduated and working in jobs and beautiful, accomplished young women. And to be in a home that I get to connect generations of my family and be in the best possible situation for my family.
What do she and your sisters think of you running for mayor?
My mom, every once in a while, will still ask me in Mandarin if I'm still doing that politics thing. With the implicit sort of question is like, isn't it time to move on from that? My siblings were very worried about it at first, right? I grew up, I'm naturally very introverted, and the first thing they said to me when I was talking to them early on about running, now almost 9 years ago, was, you care too much about what people think, right? Politics is for those with sharp elbows and insults and just, rough and tumble backdoor deals and stabbing each other in the back and this and that. And in Boston, certainly, I think some folks are in New York City and other big cities, there's an element of that. But I've realized that in being able to redefine what leadership looks like, right, as the first Asian American woman to serve in city government in Boston, I have also had a chance and a platform to redefine what politics feels like and should be, and who's valued and who should be included in that. And so we've been able to see a pretty quick transformation of Boston politics from a moment when I was first running, where there was one woman serving on the city council out of 13, to just 3 election cycles later, electing the first ever majority women, majority people of color to the council, because we have shifted the sense of possibility of who deserves a seat at the table. You described yourself as an introvert,
obviously you're an Asian American woman, and it sounds like you had a really great run on the city council. I think Teresa mentioned that you were elected president, and I'm just curious, like, how does that happen? Because it is a big city, and it has a reputation for, any city government is pretty rough and tumble, sharp elbows. You need thick skin. What was that transition like from Michelle Wu, the introvert, to Michelle Wu, the kind of rising star?
Yeah, I'll add another dimension of the transition, which is also just in communications, which was in some ways a hard lesson for me, right? As I had mentioned, growing up, the goal was always on being the hardest worker, right? And that will the results of your efforts will shine through, right? So you shouldn't be taking credit or trying to speak out or boast about yourself. And in politics, it's a dynamic. If you don't take credit, someone else will. And so that's been a difficult dynamic for me. I think naturally in paragraphs and supporting details, and then to be asked in interviews for the soundbite is still extremely hard for me to manage. But I've realized that the learning curve that I've experienced is just that. It's a learning curve. It's not a barrier that is insurmountable. And it's come through hard experiences, right? Things that I regret or have learned from. But it's also come with a moment of just giving myself the permission and the forgiveness, internal forgiveness in some ways, to be authentic and to not feel like I need to fit into this box in this space and that one in that space. And here's where I can be an Asian American, and here's where I can be a mom, and here's where I can be a young woman. But realizing that when I wear all my hats at the same time, it allows me to be a more effective, more natural communicator and politician and better mother. And it also has an impact in terms of the actual job that I'm doing as well. Prior to my joining the council, I'm only the second ever woman of color to serve on the council. Ayanna Pressley, our amazing congresswoman, was the very first. And when she was elected in 2009, that broke a huge barrier. And so when I was elected, we doubled the number of women from 1 to 2. And there was, we have since had numbers 3, 4, 5, 6 of women, 7 of women of color in quick succession over the last couple of election cycles. So it's really been very, very fast. And not that long ago that there was a narrow box of what people thought a city councilor looked like, sounded like, acted like. And I was constantly confused in the beginning around City Hall for a staff person instead of the elected official. People just didn't expect that, seeing my stature, my age, my appearance. And so that transition has been internal, right? Learning the skills and how to communicate and feeling the confidence and taking on the fights. But in some ways, it has also been about just expanding the universe of how people perceive leadership, and ways in which I was breaking the mold, not even consciously, just by being a young person, an Asian American woman, a mom, right? When we had never had a pregnant counselor before my first son came into our lives, that it shifted the norms in all sorts of ways that allowed for me to be myself and to lean into changing the definitions of what was possible for our city in policymaking and in politics.
Could you share an example of a time where you had one of those big leadership lessons and that kind of changed how you think about your leadership style and maybe what that will bring to Boston if you become mayor?
One of the first pieces of legislation that I passed was one that got a lot of national attention. It was mentioned by President Obama when he was talking on Labor Day about important initiatives that were happening, bubbling up at the city level. It was for paid parental leave. And although this is paid leave is kind of a much more given part of the national policy discourse now, 8 years ago, it was on the vanguard for cities to be taking this up. And it came about after I had my first son, my older son. But it didn't happen because I was the first pregnant counselor, and therefore I wanted to make sure that I had parental leave. In fact, city councilors and elected officials don't need to clock in and out, and this sort of standard HR policies didn't apply to us anyway. But it was the fact that we had never had a pregnant city councilor before ever in Boston. And that was such an unusual sight that when I kept doing my job, I was attending community meetings and hosting hearings and public meetings. People would come up to me and, they wanted to touch the belly and is it a boy, is it a girl, and all of those things. But then inevitably their stories would come, right? They would feel comfortable sharing their experiences as a new parent, how hard it was to juggle having a baby and then going back to work with no paid leave, or how hard it was to find childcare and this and that. And so I became, not so much because of my sort of direct need and experiencing this, but because of a whole community now feeling connected to government in a different way, seen and able to share their experiences. I became a collection point and a platform for so many stories across the city that this issue became urgent. And I remember going around City Hall as the legislation had been proposed, and we were working our way through the details and all the sausage making of the legislative process. And we didn't know if it was going to pass in 1 month or 2 months, but we were having these meetings. And it was most directly affecting City Hall workers being able to guarantee that they would have several weeks of paid parental leave. And then I started having people just pull me aside. I could tell as soon as a city worker, whether it was a parking clerk or someone who worked in the inspectional services department or in the public works department, they would say, "Can I talk to you about something?" And then they would say, "My wife is due on September 1st. Do you think the legislation is going to be done by then?" Or like, "I just found out that I'm pregnant. What do you think the timeline on the legislation looks like?" And how urgent, how much it matters to people, how much people feel personally invested when there's both representation and responsiveness in government. And so my leadership style has always been to center those who are most impacted and lean into, what sometimes could feel embarrassing to me or unprofessional about what it's like to be pregnant. And does it feel unprofessional to share my experiences, even though I'm supposed to be in this role of being a public leader? But in fact, leaning into that and being authentic opens up all sorts of avenues for better policymaking as well.
Thank you for sharing that. I can't help but think about another mayoral race that many of us were following recently, where Andrew Yang also started to lead early in the polls, and he really came across as a different kind of candidate. But ultimately, he was not able to build the coalition of support that he needed. And obviously, you have a decade of experience, at least in city service and city government, and you've been able to build that coalition. What is your approach not only to energize and win support from, obviously the AAPI community, but all of Boston? How have you been able to do that, and how will you do that going forward?
Boston is an incredibly diverse city. We are majority people of color. There are more than 110 different languages spoken by the students in the households of students in our Boston public schools. And the AAPI community makes up just about 10% of our population. So, really, there are it's a different dynamic, for example, than cities on the West Coast and some places where having a base in the API community can be a significant sort of, majority or getting you close to having the base that you need to politically get through elections. In Boston, to represent the entire city, to be elected citywide, you truly do need to have a broad coalition. And so my focus has always been on first making sure that I am sharing information and fully transparent with residents, because my theory of, having lived through this transition of knowing nothing about government to realizing that it matters, to getting mad and wanting to change things about it, to then directly being in roles to change things and to take that feedback into account, that the very first starting point has to be about information. If you don't know what's happening, if your local city officials aren't sharing the ongoing business in City Hall, then there's no way for residents to feel connected and to plug in and to be partners in doing the work. And so one small thing that I have done since my very first days on the council, in realizing that I was doing what my parents said, right? Keeping my head down and working hard and passing all this legislation or filing things and doing things. And then I would go out in the community, and because the media hadn't covered it, no one had any idea what I was doing at all, right? And there was a huge gap between what people thought was happening, which was usually the sort of most controversial headlines that ended up getting into the media, and the real work. And so I've pushed to put out through all platforms direct information to voters. And that's been really responsible, a high priority to have that responsive relationship with residents. And then to show up to treat governing and campaigning as closely as possible, that when you are campaigning, you're not just saying what you need to say to get the vote and then be done with it, but you are laying the plans and bringing people into the process to then deliver change in office. And then when you are in office, treating each day with the urgency as if you needed to be on the ballot immediately, right? And to seek the feedback and have the visibility in communities with the same pace and commitment. I think once we sort of eliminate the clear silos between campaigning and governing, we will have a much more connected democracy and also much more impactful policymaking.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I would like to now hand the remaining time back to Alec and others to get some Q&A from the audience who've been waiting very patiently, but really appreciate you sharing your perspective and stories in this part of the fireside chat.
Thank you so much, Tom.